22 years ago, on a crisp October afternoon in 2003, sisters Emma and Sarah Mitchell vanished without a trace from their quiet neighborhood in Cedar Falls, a small town nestled in the heart of Iowa. Emma, 14, and Sarah, 12, had walked home from school together as they did every day, their backpacks heavy with homework they would never complete. Their disappearance plunged their family into an unimaginable tragedy, casting a shadow of grief over their parents, Michael and Linda Mitchell, that would never lift. The entire community of Cedar Falls, population barely 3,000, was thrown into confusion and fear as their children were no longer safe to walk alone. Before continuing, please subscribe, like this video, and hit the notification bell. This helps our channel bring you more stories like this one. The Cedar Falls Police Department, understaffed and inexperienced with such cases, considered various possibilities in those first crucial hours. They explored the theory of a runaway scenario. Despite the girls' stable home life and excellent academic records, they investigated potential abduction by strangers, combing through registered sex offenders in a 50-mile radius. They even questioned family members and close friends, following standard protocol that often points to those closest to the victims. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the case grew cold, leaving behind only unanswered questions and a community forever changed. The initial investigation revealed troubling gaps in procedure and resources. The small-town police force, led by Chief Robert Hendricks, had never handled a case of this magnitude. Evidence collection was inconsistent, witness statements were taken haphazardly, and crucial hours were lost in the first 48-hour window that experts consider vital for missing persons cases. The FBI was called in 3 days after the disappearance, but by then any immediate leads had grown cold. The girls' bedroom remained untouched, their beds still unmade, their clothes still in hampers waiting to be washed. Michael Mitchell, a local mechanic, and Linda Mitchell, a part-time librarian, refused to give up hope. They organized search parties that scoured the surrounding farmland and wooded areas week after week. They printed thousands of flyers with their daughters' smiling faces, distributed them across 3 counties, and maintained a constant presence in local media. The strain on their marriage was evident to everyone who knew them, but their shared determination to find Emma and Sarah kept them united in their desperate quest for answers. The community rallied around the Mitchell family in those early months. Neighbors took turns bringing meals, local businesses donated money for reward funds, and volunteers joined search efforts every weekend. But as 2003 became 2004, and then 2005, the intensity of public attention began to wane. People moved on with their lives, children grew up, and new concerns took precedence. Only the Mitchell family remained frozen in time, trapped in that October afternoon when their world collapsed. Friends and teachers described Emma as a natural leader, popular among her peers and academically gifted. She had dreams of becoming a veterinarian and spent her free time volunteering at the local animal shelter. Sarah, quieter but equally beloved, showed exceptional artistic talent and had recently won a regional art competition. Their absence left a void not just in their family, but in their school and community activities. The art room at Cedar Falls Middle School still displays Sarah's last painting, a landscape of the town's main street that now serves as an unintended memorial. The official investigation file grew thick with dead ends and false leads. Psychics claimed to have visions of the girl's location, all proving fruitless. Anonymous tips poured in from across the country, each one investigated and dismissed. The Amber Alert system, still relatively new in 2003, was activated, but yielded no concrete results. As months passed, the case was quietly moved from active investigation to cold case status, though Chief Hendricks assured the Mitchell family that it would never be forgotten. Years of silence followed, punctuated only by the Mitchell family's annual press conferences on the anniversary of the disappearance. Michael's hair turned grey, Linda's smile became increasingly rare, and their marriage, though intact, bore the visible scars of prolonged grief and frustration. They attended support groups for families of missing children, traveled to conferences about cold cases, and consulted with private investigators when their savings allowed. Nothing brought them closer to answers. The turning point would not come for another decade, when advances in investigative technology and a persistent new detective would finally unlock the secrets that Cedar Falls had kept buried. Sometimes truth lies not in distant places, but in the shadows of the familiar, waiting patiently to be discovered. In the aftermath of Emma and Sarah Mitchell's disappearance, the tight-knit community of Cedar Falls found itself under an intense microscope. Every neighbor, every family friend, every casual acquaintance became a potential suspect in the eyes of investigators and anxious parents alike. Among those questioned were Thomas and Margaret Hoffman, the couple who lived just 3 houses down from the Mitchell family on Maple Street. Their white colonial house, with its perfectly manicured lawn and cheerful garden gnomes, had been a fixture in the neighborhood for over 15 years. Thomas Hoffman, 52, worked as a supervisor at the local grain elevator, a steady job that provided well for his family of 3. His wife Margaret, 48, was a substitute teacher at the elementary school and occasionally helped with church functions at Cedar Falls Methodist. Their son David, 19, had graduated from Cedar Falls High School the previous spring and was working at his father's grain elevator while saving money for community college. To everyone who knew them, the Hoffmans represented stability and normalcy in a town where those qualities were highly valued. The family had moved to Cedar Falls in 1988, when David was just 4 years old. Thomas had been transferred from a similar position in Des Moines, seeking a quieter life for his young family. Margaret quickly integrated into the community, joining the PTA and volunteering for various school events. They were regular churchgoers, attended town festivals, and Thomas coached Little League Baseball for several seasons. Their integration into Cedar Falls society appeared seamless and genuine. Detective Lisa Chen, the lead investigator in the Mitchell case, conducted routine interviews with the Hoffman family just 4 days after the disappearance. In her notes, she described Thomas as cooperative but nervous, which she attributed to the general anxiety affecting everyone in the neighborhood. Margaret appeared distraught about the missing girls, mentioning that she had taught both Emma and Sarah when they were younger and remembered them as delightful children. David, who had known the girls through school activities, seemed genuinely shocked by their disappearance and offered to help with search efforts. The interview revealed that the Hoffmans had been home on the afternoon of October 15, 2003. Thomas had returned from work around 4:30 p.m. Margaret had been grading papers at the kitchen table, and David was in the garage working on his car, a hobby he had pursued throughout high school. None of them recalled seeing Emma and Sarah that day, though Margaret mentioned that she usually saw them walking home from school around 3:45 p.m. The family's alibi seemed solid, corroborated by Thomas's time card at the grain elevator and Margaret's phone call with her sister that afternoon. What struck Detective Chen as particularly noteworthy was the family's immediate willingness to help. Thomas volunteered to join search parties, Margaret offered to coordinate meal deliveries for the Mitchell family, and David spent his weekends distributing flyers throughout the county. Their involvement appeared to come from genuine concern and community spirit. When the FBI arrived to conduct more thorough background checks, the Hoffman family passed every scrutiny with flying colors. Thomas Hoffman's employment history showed steady work and positive references. Margaret's teaching record was spotless, with glowing recommendations from principals and parents alike. David, despite some typical teenage troubles, a speeding ticket and an underage drinking citation, had no history of serious behavioral problems. The family's financial records showed nothing unusual. Their phone records from that period revealed only routine calls, and their travel patterns aligned with their stated activities. Neighbors consistently described the Hoffmans as helpful and friendly. Mrs. Eleanor Peterson, who lived directly across the street, remembered Margaret bringing her homemade soup when she was recovering from hip surgery. Jim Bradley, whose property bordered the Hoffmans' backyard, praised Thomas for helping him repair a fence damaged in a storm. The Hendersons, who lived next door, recalled numerous barbecues and holiday gatherings where the Hoffman family had been gracious hosts. The only minor inconsistency in the neighborhood testimonials came from old Mr. George Whitman, who lived at the end of the block. He mentioned sometimes hearing odd sounds coming from the direction of the Hoffman house late at night, but acknowledged that his hearing wasn't what it used to be, and he couldn't be specific about what he'd heard. Detective Chen noted this comment, but gave it little weight, considering Mr. Whitman's advanced age and the vague nature of his observations. As the investigation progressed through its first year, the Hoffman family remained exemplary community members. They attended every prayer vigil for Emma and Sarah, contributed generously to the reward fund, and never wavered in their support for the Mitchell family. Margaret even organized a memorial garden in the town square, complete with a bench where people could sit and remember the missing girls. Their dedication to the cause seemed to go above and beyond what might be expected from casual neighbors. The perfect neighbors had seemingly perfect lives, untouched by the darkness that had consumed the Mitchell family and shaken Cedar Falls to its core. The investigation into Emma and Sarah Mitchell's disappearance consumed the resources of the Cedar Falls Police Department for months. Detective Lisa Chen, despite her best efforts, found herself chasing shadows and following leads that invariably led nowhere. The case file grew thick with interviews, photographs, and forensic reports that painted a picture of thorough investigation but yielded no concrete answers. By the spring of 2004, 6 months after the girls vanished, the daily urgency that had driven the initial search efforts had settled into a more methodical, long-term approach. Among the evidence collected during those early months were soil samples from various locations around Cedar Falls. The FBI's forensic team had taken samples from the Mitchell family's backyard, from areas along the girls' usual route home from school, and from several properties where witness reports had suggested unusual activity. These samples sat in evidence storage, meticulously labeled and catalogued, waiting for technology or circumstances that might make them relevant to the investigation. The Hoffman property had been among those sampled, purely as part of the systematic grid search that covered the entire neighborhood. Thomas Hoffman had been cooperative when investigators requested permission to search his property, even offering to help move garden tools and lawn furniture to give them better access. The search of the Hoffmans' yard had been thorough, but revealed nothing of interest. No disturbed earth, no hidden objects, no indication that anything unusual had occurred on their well-maintained property. What the investigators in 2004 could not have known was that advances in forensic science over the following decade would make evidence analysis far more sophisticated and revealing. DNA testing that required large samples in 2004 could be performed on microscopic traces by 2013. Chemical analysis that took weeks in 2004 could be completed in days a decade later. The soil samples that seemed unremarkable in the early investigation would eventually tell a very different story. During those first years after the disappearance, the Hoffman family continued their normal routines, while living under the subtle scrutiny that affected everyone in Cedar Falls. Thomas maintained his position at the grain elevator, receiving regular promotions that reflected his steady work ethic. Margaret continued substitute teaching, though she mentioned to friends that working with children had become more emotionally difficult since Emma and Sarah's disappearance. David eventually enrolled at the community college in Waterloo, commuting daily from his parents' home while studying automotive technology. The family's property remained a model of suburban perfection. Margaret's flower gardens bloomed each spring in carefully planned arrangements of colors and textures. Thomas's lawn was always precisely mowed, edged and fertilized. The family's white colonial house received a fresh coat of paint in 2006, and they added a small storage shed in the backyard in 2008. To casual observers, the Hoffmans represented resilience and stability in a community still healing from tragedy. But beneath the surface of this normalcy, subtle changes were occurring. Neighbors began to notice that Margaret seemed more withdrawn, less likely to engage in casual conversation over garden fences. Thomas, once a regular at the local diner, where town gossip was shared over coffee and pie, began eating lunch alone in his truck. David, who had been popular in high school, developed a reputation for being increasingly solitary and moody during his college years. The most significant change, though subtle enough that most neighbors didn't consciously notice it, was in the family's use of their basement. Prior to 2003, the Hoffmans had hosted holiday gatherings and summer parties that often spilled into their finished basement recreation room. Margaret had mentioned to friends how much she enjoyed having the extra space for entertaining. After 2004, however, the basement seemed to disappear from the family's social life. Invitations to Hoffman gatherings became rare, and when they did occur, guests were entertained exclusively on the main floor and back patio. Mrs. Eleanor Peterson, the observant neighbor across the street, later recalled wondering about the change but attributing it to the general mood shift that had affected everyone in Cedar Falls after the Mitchell girls' disappearance. People were less social, more guarded, more likely to keep their personal lives private. What had once been a community where neighbors regularly visited each other's homes became more reserved, more careful about boundaries and privacy. The basement that had once been a center of social activity gradually became a source of private anxiety for the Hoffman family. Margaret began experiencing what she described to her doctor as inexplicable nervousness when doing laundry in the basement. Thomas, who had previously used the basement as a workshop for his various home improvement projects, moved his tools to the garage. David, who had once practiced guitar in the basement to avoid disturbing his parents, relocated his musical activities to his upstairs bedroom. These changes, seemingly minor and easily explained by the general trauma affecting the community, were actually symptoms of a much darker reality. The Hoffman basement held secrets that would remain buried for nearly a decade, secrets that would eventually surface through the persistence of new investigators and the advancement of forensic science. Sometimes the most dangerous secrets are hidden in the most familiar places, beneath the feet of those who walk above them every day, never suspecting what lies waiting in the darkness below. By 2012, 9 years after Emma and Sarah Mitchell's disappearance, the case had become a source of frustration and professional regret for the Cedar Falls Police Department. Chief Robert Hendricks, now nearing retirement, carried the weight of the unsolved case like a personal burden. The file had been reviewed countless times, new leads had been investigated and dismissed, and the community had largely moved on with their lives. The Mitchell family, though still residing in Cedar Falls, had become increasingly isolated in their grief, maintaining hope that seemed to diminish with each passing year. The arrival of Detective Marcus Rivera in the spring of 2013 brought fresh energy to the cold case division. Rivera, 38, had transferred from Chicago PD's Special Victims Unit, where he had developed a reputation for solving cases that others had given up on. His decision to move to Iowa was personal. He wanted a quieter life for his own family, but his professional standards remained uncompromisingly high. Rivera's first request upon joining the Cedar Falls force was access to all unsolved cases from the previous decade. The Mitchell case immediately caught Rivera's attention, not because of any obvious clues that previous investigators had missed, but because of the gaps in the investigation that reflected the limitations of small-town law enforcement resources. Rivera had worked similar cases in Chicago and understood that time could be both an enemy and an ally in cold case investigations. While evidence degrades and witnesses' memories fade, advances in forensic science and investigative techniques often provide new opportunities to examine old evidence. Rivera's approach to cold cases was methodical and comprehensive. He began by re-interviewing everyone who had been questioned in the original investigation, looking not for new information, but for inconsistencies or details that might have seemed unimportant in 2003, but could be significant in light of current investigative knowledge. He also reviewed all physical evidence using current forensic capabilities, understanding that soil samples, fiber analysis, and trace evidence could now reveal information that was impossible to detect a decade earlier. The detective's first breakthrough came not from dramatic new evidence, but from careful analysis of the original investigation timeline. Rivera noticed that several interviews had been conducted hastily during the initial search phase, when investigators were focused more on immediate rescue efforts than on building a prosecutable case. The interview with the Hoffman family, in particular, had been brief and superficial, conducted just 4 days after the disappearance when everyone was still in shock. Rivera decided to reapproach the Hoffman family, not as suspects, but as neighbors who might remember additional details after having nearly a decade to process the traumatic events. He called ahead to schedule the interview, explaining that he was reviewing all aspects of the original investigation with fresh eyes. Thomas Hoffman agreed to meet, though Rivera noted a distinct nervousness in his voice that seemed disproportionate to the routine nature of the request. The interview took place at the Hoffman home on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in October 2013, almost exactly 10 years after Emma and Sarah's disappearance. Rivera was struck by how well-maintained the property appeared, almost obsessively perfect in its presentation. Thomas Hoffman, now 62, seemed aged beyond his years, his hair completely grey and his manner more guarded than Detective Chen had described in her original notes. Margaret Hoffman, 58, appeared even more changed by the passage of time. Where previous reports had described her as warm and outgoing, Rivera found her withdrawn and anxious, frequently glancing toward the basement door during their conversation. Her answers to his questions were brief and sometimes inconsistent with statements she had made in 2003, though Rivera attributed this to the normal degradation of memory over time. David Hoffman, now 29, and working as an automotive technician in Waterloo, still lived with his parents. Rivera found this arrangement somewhat unusual for a man approaching 30, but not necessarily suspicious. David's demeanor during the interview was sullen and uncooperative, markedly different from the helpful teenager described in the original case files. When Rivera asked about his memories of Emma and Sarah, David claimed he barely remembered them, despite having attended school with both girls. The most significant moment of the interview came when Rivera asked about changes the family had made to their property over the past decade. Thomas mentioned the storage shed built in 2008, the new paint job in 2006, and some landscaping updates Margaret had completed. However, when Rivera asked about the basement renovation that building permits showed had been completed in 2004, both Thomas and Margaret claimed not to remember any such renovation. This inconsistency, while minor, caught Rivera's attention. Building permits were public record, and the Hoffmans had clearly applied for and received permission to do significant work in their basement during the months immediately following the Mitchell girls' disappearance. The fact that they claimed no memory of this substantial home improvement project struck Rivera as either remarkably forgetful or deliberately deceptive. As Rivera prepared to leave the Hoffman home that afternoon, he made a mental note to research the basement renovation more thoroughly. Sometimes the most important clues hide in plain sight, buried in paperwork and public records that no one thinks to examine carefully. Detective Marcus Rivera's investigation into the Hoffman family's basement renovation led him down a path that would fundamentally change the Mitchell case. The building permit, filed in February 2004, just 4 months after Emma and Sarah's disappearance, indicated substantial structural work, including the installation of a new concrete floor and the creation of what the permit described as additional storage space. The permit had been approved without the routine inspection that should have followed completion of the work. Rivera's research revealed that the inspection had been scheduled for March 15, 2004, but Thomas Hoffman had called to cancel it, claiming that the family had decided not to proceed with the renovation due to cost concerns. This cancellation should have resulted in the revocation of the permit, but due to administrative oversight, it had remained in the system as completed. The missed inspection, buried in the bureaucratic maze of small-town record-keeping, had gone unnoticed for nearly a decade. Armed with this information, Rivera obtained a warrant to conduct a more thorough search of the Hoffman property, focusing specifically on the basement. The warrant was based on the discrepancy between the official building records and the family's claims, as well as advances in ground-penetrating radar technology that could detect subsurface anomalies without requiring excavation. Rivera was careful to ensure that all legal procedures were followed meticulously, knowing that any evidence discovered would need to withstand rigorous scrutiny in court. The search took place on a grey November morning in 2013, exactly 10 years and 1 month after Emma and Sarah Mitchell had vanished. Rivera led a team that included FBI forensic specialists, a ground-penetrating radar technician, and K-9 units specially trained in cadaver detection. The Hoffman family was relocated to a hotel for the duration of the search, with Thomas, Margaret, and David maintaining their innocence while expressing bewilderment at the investigation's focus on their home. The basement of the Hoffman house appeared, at first glance, to be an ordinary suburban recreation room. Wood-paneled walls lined with family photographs, a comfortable seating area with an old television, and standard basement amenities, including laundry facilities and storage closets. The concrete floor, supposedly installed in 2004, showed no obvious signs of recent disturbance. However, the ground-penetrating radar revealed irregularities beneath the floor that warranted further investigation. The cadaver dogs became immediately alert in the northeast corner of the basement, near what appeared to be a small storage closet. The animals' behavior was unmistakable to their handlers. They had detected the scent signature of human decomposition, despite the concrete barrier that separated them from whatever lay beneath. This discovery provided Rivera with probable cause to begin excavation, a process that would need to be conducted with extreme care to preserve any evidence that might be recovered. The excavation began that same afternoon, with forensic technicians using specialized equipment to carefully remove sections of the concrete floor. The work was painstakingly slow, with every fragment of concrete, every grain of soil, and every potential piece of evidence being documented, photographed, and preserved. As the hours passed, Rivera felt the weight of the moment. 10 years of investigation might finally be approaching resolution. 3 feet beneath the concrete floor, wrapped in plastic tarps and buried in a carefully constructed chamber, investigators discovered the remains of Emma and Sarah Mitchell. The preservation of evidence was remarkable due to the sealed environment created by the concrete floor above and the careful preparation of the burial site. Initial forensic examination confirmed the identities through dental records, bringing a definitive end to a decade of uncertainty while opening a new chapter focused on justice and prosecution. The discovery sent shockwaves through Cedar Falls and beyond. The Hoffman family, who had lived as respected members of the community for over 2 decades, were taken into custody as the investigation shifted from missing persons to homicide. The basement that had once hosted holiday gatherings and family celebrations had concealed one of Iowa's most disturbing crimes, hidden beneath the feet of neighbors and friends who had unknowingly walked above the burial site for 10 years. If this case has already captivated you, please leave a like. It helps our channel bring more stories like this and helps Emma and Sarah's story reach more people. The revelation that the perpetrators had been hiding in plain sight, maintaining normal lives while concealing such a horrific secret, challenged everything the community thought they knew about trust, safety, and the people they called neighbors. Sometimes the most unthinkable crimes are committed by those we least suspect, those who smile and wave from across the street while harboring darkness that defies comprehension. The arrest of Thomas, Margaret, and David Hoffman on November 18, 2013, marked the beginning of the most intensive interrogation in Cedar Falls history. Detective Rivera, working alongside FBI behavioral analysts, faced the challenging task of extracting confessions from 3 individuals who had successfully maintained their deception for exactly 10 years and 1 month. The initial interviews revealed a family united in their denials, each member claiming complete innocence and expressing shock at the discovery in their basement. Thomas Hoffman, as the apparent head of the household, became the primary focus of Rivera's interrogation strategy. The detective understood that breaking Thomas's silence would likely create a cascade effect, leading to admissions from other family members. The interrogation began with a careful review of the physical evidence, the location of the remains, the timing of the basement renovation, and the building permit discrepancies that had led to the discovery. Thomas maintained his innocence, but became increasingly agitated as the evidence mounted against him. The breakthrough came on the 3rd day of questioning, when Rivera presented Thomas with forensic evidence linking fibers from the plastic tarps to clothing found in the Hoffman home. The fibers were microscopically identical to material from a tarp found in Thomas's workshop, a tarp that had been purchased in November 2003, just weeks after Emma and Sarah's disappearance. Faced with this undeniable physical connection, Thomas finally began to crack under the pressure of overwhelming evidence. Thomas's confession, when it finally came, revealed a crime far more disturbing than investigators had imagined. According to his statement, the events of October 15, 2003 had begun with what he claimed was an accidental encounter. Emma and Sarah Mitchell had allegedly cut through the Hoffmans' backyard on their way home from school, a route they had never taken before. Thomas claimed that he had confronted the girls about trespassing and that an argument had escalated beyond his control. The details Thomas provided painted a picture of spontaneous violence followed by calculated cover-up. He admitted to killing both girls during the confrontation, but claimed that their deaths had been unintentional, the result of panic rather than premeditation. However, his subsequent actions, the careful burial, the basement renovation, and the decade of deception, suggested a level of planning and cold calculation that contradicted his claims of accidental involvement. Margaret Hoffman's role in the crime became clear through her subsequent confession, delivered 2 days after her husband's admission. Margaret revealed that she had been present during the initial confrontation and had helped Thomas move the girls' bodies into the basement. Her statement described a marriage dominated by Thomas's violent temper and her own paralyzing fear of challenging his decisions. She claimed to have lived in constant terror for 10 years, knowing what lay buried beneath their feet, but too frightened to seek help. The most shocking revelation came from David Hoffman's confession, which exposed the full extent of the family's complicity. David admitted that he had also been present during the murders, having returned home early from his job at the grain elevator. His statement described participating in the burial and actively helping to plan the basement renovation that would permanently conceal the crime. David's confession shattered any remaining illusions about accidental involvement, revealing the murders as a family conspiracy that had lasted a decade. The confessions revealed disturbing details about the Hoffman family's life after the murders. They described living with constant anxiety about discovery, carefully monitoring news coverage of the investigation, and maintaining their facade of helpful neighbors, while knowing they were responsible for the community's greatest tragedy. Margaret's confession included details about her inability to sleep, her increasing reliance on prescription medication, and her growing isolation from friends and community activities. David's statement provided insight into the psychological toll of concealing such a massive secret during his formative adult years. He described years of nightmares, difficulty maintaining relationships, and an increasing dependence on alcohol to cope with guilt and fear. His decision to remain living with his parents, which investigators had initially found unusual, was revealed to be the result of his inability to function independently while carrying the weight of the shared secret. The confessions also revealed the careful planning that had gone into maintaining their deception. The family had rehearsed their alibis, coordinated their statements to investigators, and even discussed contingency plans for various scenarios that might arise during the investigation. Their participation in search efforts and community support activities was revealed to be calculated misdirection, designed to deflect suspicion while maintaining their image as caring neighbors. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the revelation that the murders had occurred not in a moment of uncontrollable rage, but during a planned abduction that had gone wrong. Thomas's final confession admitted that he had been watching Emma and Sarah for weeks, planning an opportunity to lure them into his house. The accidental encounter he had initially described was revealed to be a deliberate attempt at kidnapping that had escalated to murder when the girls had fought back. The confessions brought closure to the Mitchell family's decade-long nightmare, while opening new wounds for a community that had trusted and supported their daughter's killers for 10 years. The revelation that Emma and Sarah Mitchell had been murdered by their trusted neighbors sent shockwaves far beyond the boundaries of Cedar Falls. The Hoffman family had not merely hidden among the community, they had actively participated in the collective mourning, the search efforts, and the decade-long vigil for justice. Their deception represented a betrayal so profound that it challenged the very foundations of trust upon which small-town life is built. Michael and Linda Mitchell, who had endured 10 years of uncertainty and false hope, now faced the devastating reality that their daughter's killers had been living just 3 houses away throughout their entire ordeal. The Hoffmans had attended every memorial service, contributed to every reward fund, and offered comfort and support while secretly knowing exactly what had happened to Emma and Sarah. The psychological impact of this revelation proved almost more devastating than the original loss. Linda Mitchell's statement to investigators revealed the depth of the betrayal. She described countless interactions with Margaret Hoffman over the years, shared conversations about the missing girls, Margaret's apparent emotional support during the darkest moments, and her involvement in organizing memorial events. Margaret had even helped Linda plant flowers in the memorial garden, all while knowing that Emma and Sarah lay buried beneath her own basement floor. The community's reaction was swift and visceral. Neighbors who had shared meals with the Hoffmans, attended church services alongside them, and trusted them with their own children, now grappled with the reality of how completely they had been deceived. Mrs. Eleanor Peterson, who had lived across the street from the family for over 2 decades, described feeling physically ill when she realized that she had unknowingly waved hello to child killers every morning for 10 years. The psychological impact extended beyond individual relationships to challenge the community's entire sense of security and trust. Parents who had allowed their children to play in the Hoffmans' yard, who had hired David to do odd jobs, who had accepted Margaret's offers to babysit, now questioned their ability to judge character and protect their families. The sense of violated trust permeated every aspect of community life. Reverend William Hayes of Cedar Falls Methodist Church, where the Hoffman family had been active members, struggled to help his congregation process the betrayal. The church had been where the family had maintained their most visible facade of normalcy and virtue. Thomas had served as an usher, Margaret had helped coordinate charity drives, and David had participated in youth activities. The revelation forced the church community to confront how thoroughly evil could masquerade as goodness. The investigation revealed additional layers of deception that had extended beyond the immediate crime. The Hoffmans had used their involvement in search efforts to gather information about police activities and investigation progress. Thomas had volunteered for search parties partly to ensure that certain areas, particularly those near his property, received the kind of superficial attention that would prevent more thorough investigation. Margaret's role as a substitute teacher had provided her with access to school records and activities, allowing the family to monitor how Emma and Sarah's disappearance was being discussed among students and faculty. Her apparent emotional distress when working with children, which colleagues had attributed to empathy for the missing girls, was revealed to be guilt and anxiety about her own role in their deaths. The decade of deception had required constant vigilance and coordination among the three family members. David's confession revealed family meetings where they had discussed investigation developments, refined their stories, and planned responses to various scenarios. They had even practiced their emotional reactions to news about the case, ensuring that their public responses appeared appropriately concerned but not suspiciously informed. The community's sense of betrayal was compounded by the realization that many of their own actions had inadvertently helped the Hoffmans maintain their deception. Well-meaning neighbors had praised the family's strength and resilience in the face of community tragedy. Their continued presence at memorial events had been interpreted as dedication and compassion rather than calculated misdirection. Local law enforcement also faced community criticism for failing to detect the deception earlier. Chief Hendricks, now retired, publicly acknowledged that the investigation had been hampered by the assumption that people who appeared helpful and concerned were unlikely to be involved in the crime. The case highlighted fundamental flaws in investigative approaches that relied too heavily on surface appearances and community standing. The Hoffman house itself became a source of community trauma. The white colonial that had once represented suburban normalcy now stood as a monument to deception and evil. Neighbors reported being unable to look at the property without feeling sick, and property values throughout the neighborhood plummeted as the stigma of association affected everyone who lived nearby. Perhaps most disturbing was the realization that the community had unknowingly participated in the perpetrator's psychological torment of the Mitchell family. Every time someone mentioned how wonderful it was that the Hoffmans continued to support the search for Emma and Sarah, they were inadvertently twisting the knife in the wound. The killers had not only escaped justice, they had been praised for their supposed virtue, while their victims' parents suffered in ignorance. The betrayal ran so deep that it fundamentally changed how the residents of Cedar Falls related to each other, creating a permanent undercurrent of suspicion and wariness that would never fully heal. The legal proceedings against Thomas, Margaret, and David Hoffman began in early 2014, presenting prosecutors with the complex challenge of pursuing justice for crimes that had been concealed for over a decade. The case attracted national media attention, not only for the shocking nature of the murders, but for the extraordinary deception that had allowed the perpetrators to hide in plain sight for 10 years. Iowa Attorney General Sarah Martinez personally took charge of the prosecution, understanding that the case would set important precedents for how the justice system handles long-concealed crimes. The prosecution team faced unique challenges in building their case. While the physical evidence was overwhelming, the bodies had been remarkably well preserved due to the sealed environment created by the concrete floor. The passage of time had complicated many other aspects of the case. Witnesses' memories had faded, some potential witnesses had died or moved away, and the crime scene had been altered by the decade of normal family life that had occurred above the burial site. Thomas Hoffman's legal team, led by experienced criminal defense attorney Robert Klein, initially pursued a strategy based on his client's claims of accidental involvement. They argued that what had occurred on October 15, 2003, had been a tragic accident that had spiraled out of control due to panic and poor judgment. However, this defense crumbled under the weight of forensic evidence that revealed the careful planning and deliberate nature of both the murders and the subsequent cover-up. The forensic evidence presented at trial painted a damning picture of premeditation and calculation. Autopsy results showed that both Emma and Sarah had been killed by manual strangulation, with evidence of significant struggle. The positioning of the bodies and the careful preparation of the burial site indicated extensive planning rather than spontaneous panic. Most damaging to the defense was evidence that the girls had been kept alive for several hours after their initial capture, during which time the family had ample opportunity to contact authorities instead of choosing murder. Margaret Hoffman's defense attorney, Linda Foster, attempted to portray her client as a victim of domestic abuse who had been terrorized into compliance by her husband's violent nature. This strategy gained some traction when evidence emerged of Thomas's history of controlling behavior and several unreported incidents of domestic violence. However, Margaret's active participation in the planning and execution of the cover-up, including her role in purchasing materials for the burial, and her performance during the decade of deception, undermined claims that she had been merely a coerced participant. David Hoffman presented the most complex legal challenge. At 19 years old at the time of the murders, he was legally an adult, but his defense team argued that his youth and the influence of his dominating father should be considered mitigating factors. They portrayed him as a young man caught in an impossible situation, torn between loyalty to his family and moral revulsion at their actions. However, David's confession had revealed not only his participation in the murders, but his role in planning the cover-up and maintaining the deception throughout his adult life. The trial testimony provided the public with a detailed reconstruction of the crimes and their aftermath. Detective Rivera's investigation was praised for its thoroughness and innovative use of forensic technology. The basement excavation had been conducted with such care that investigators had been able to recover not only the victims' remains, but also physical evidence, including fragments of the girls' clothing, school materials, and personal items that had been buried with them. Expert witnesses testified about the psychological profiles of the defendants, with particular focus on how the family had managed to maintain their deception for such an extended period. Dr. Patricia Williams, a forensic psychologist, explained that successful long-term deception requires a level of coordination and emotional control that suggests sophisticated criminal planning rather than spontaneous criminal behavior. The most emotionally powerful testimony came from Michael and Linda Mitchell, who described not only the decade of agony they had endured wondering about their daughter's fate, but the additional trauma of learning that their supporters and comforters had been their daughter's killers. Michael's statement to the court included his description of the hollow feeling that came with realizing that every expression of sympathy from the Hoffman family had been a calculated act of psychological cruelty. The community impact testimony revealed the broader damage caused by the Hoffmans' decade of deception. Neighbors described their ongoing inability to trust their own judgment about people's character. Parents testified about the additional anxiety they now felt about their children's safety, knowing that danger could be hidden behind the most ordinary and trustworthy facades. On September 15, 2014, nearly 11 years after Emma and Sarah Mitchell's disappearance, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all charges against all three defendants. Thomas Hoffman was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, with additional charges for kidnapping and concealing evidence. Margaret Hoffman was convicted of 2 counts of second-degree murder and conspiracy charges. David Hoffman was convicted of 2 counts of second-degree murder, acknowledging his participation while recognizing the influence of his family situation. The sentencing phase brought additional testimony about the impact of the crimes and the appropriate punishment for such extraordinary deception and cruelty. The prosecution argued for maximum sentences, emphasizing that the decade of deception represented a continuing crime against both the victims' families and the community at large. Thomas Hoffman received 2 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. Margaret Hoffman was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. David Hoffman, considering his age at the time of the crimes and his cooperation with investigators, received a sentence of 45 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. The sentences provided legal closure to the case while acknowledging that true justice for Emma and Sarah Mitchell could never be fully achieved. The decade of lost time, the years of false hope and misdirected grief, and the community's shattered trust could never be restored through any court proceeding. 5 years have passed since the Hoffman family received their sentences for the murders of Emma and Sarah Mitchell, The white colonial house at 1247 Maple Street has been demolished, its foundation filled in and the lot converted to a small memorial park where the community gathers each October 15th to remember the girls and reflect on the lessons learned from their tragic case. Cedar Falls has slowly begun to heal, though the scars from a decade of deception remain visible in the way neighbors interact and parents watch their children. The Mitchell family has found a measure of peace in knowing the truth, though the pain of their loss will never fully diminish. Michael and Linda Mitchell have become advocates for missing children cases, working with law enforcement agencies to improve investigation protocols and support services for families of victims. They have established the Emma and Sarah Mitchell Foundation, which provides funding for advanced forensic techniques in cold cases and training for small-town police departments that lack resources for complex investigations. Detective Marcus Rivera's innovative approach to the case has become a model for cold case investigations nationwide. His methodical review of building permits, public records, and seemingly insignificant discrepancies has been incorporated into FBI training programs for investigators working on long, unsolved cases. Rivera continues to work cold cases in Cedar Falls and surrounding counties, applying the same thoroughness that brought justice for Emma and Sarah to other families still waiting for answers. The case has had lasting impacts on investigative procedures and community safety protocols throughout Iowa and beyond. Police departments now receive training on recognizing the patterns of long-term deception and the psychological profiles of perpetrators who successfully integrate into their communities while hiding serious crimes. The importance of thorough follow-up on building permits, property modifications, and other public records has become standard practice in missing persons investigations. The Hoffman family members continue serving their sentences in separate facilities within the Iowa correctional system. Thomas Hoffman, now 73, has shown no remorse for his crimes and continues to maintain that the murders were accidental despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Margaret Hoffman has participated in therapy programs and has expressed genuine remorse for her role in the crimes and the subsequent deception. David Hoffman, who will be eligible for parole in 2039, has become involved in victim advocacy programs within the prison system. The community of Cedar Falls has implemented new safety protocols and community watch programs designed to prevent similar tragedies. Regular training sessions help residents recognize suspicious behavior and reporting procedures, while children receive age-appropriate education about personal safety and the importance of immediately reporting any uncomfortable situations. The memorial garden where Margaret Hoffman once helped plant flowers has been expanded to include educational elements about child safety and crime prevention. The case has contributed to advances in forensic archaeology and ground-penetrating radar technology. The techniques used to locate Emma and Sarah's remains have been refined and are now used in missing persons cases worldwide. The careful excavation and evidence recovery procedures developed during the Hoffman basement investigation have become the standard for similar operations, ensuring that other families might someday receive the answers that eluded the Mitchells for 10 years. Perhaps most importantly, the case has served as a stark reminder that evil can wear the most ordinary faces and hide behind the most respectable facades. The decade of deception perpetrated by the Hoffman family has changed how communities think about trust, safety, and the people they welcome into their neighborhoods. While this increased vigilance has led to some unfortunate side effects, including increased suspicion and reduced social cohesion in some communities, it has also prevented other potential tragedies by encouraging people to report suspicious behavior rather than dismissing their concerns. The memorial park that now stands where the Hoffman house once cast its shadow over Maple Street serves as a permanent reminder of Emma and Sarah Mitchell's young lives and the importance of never giving up the search for truth. The bench where visitors can sit and remember carries a simple inscription, in memory of Emma and Sarah Mitchell, whose truth emerged from darkness through the persistence of love and the advancement of justice. The Emma and Sarah Mitchell case will continue to influence criminal justice practices and community safety protocols for generations to come. Their story serves as both a tragedy and a testament to the power of persistence in the pursuit of truth. While justice came far too late for the girls themselves, their legacy lives on in the lives potentially saved by the investigative techniques developed during the search for their killers and the safety protocols implemented in their memory. The case reminds us that sometimes truth lies buried not just in the earth, but in the careful examination of details that others might overlook, in the persistence of investigators who refuse to give up, and in the advancement of science that can finally give voice to those who can no longer speak for themselves. Emma and Sarah Mitchell's voices were silenced on October 15, 2003, but their story continues to speak volumes about the importance of justice, truth, and the unbreakable bonds of family love that persist even in the face of unimaginable tragedy. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following Emma and Sarah Mitchell's story. We'll see you in the next video. In the darkness of the basement where innocence was buried, truth waited patiently for the light of justice to finally shine.